Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning, good afternoon, good night, wherever you might be in the world. I am here today with two very special guests, Werner Zagrebbi and Professor Walter Block. We are going to have a dialogue on whether sovereign corporations are better than anarcho-capitalism. Werner, I think, is going to argue that they are, and Walter Block will argue that anarcho-capitalism is preferable. So, Werner, I think we can start with your introductory speech.
Yeah, really cool. Thanks so much for having me, Simon. And thanks so much for doing this, Professor Block, who I've known your work for so long, definitely one of our
Let
finest.
me let me interrupt you,
Yeah.
Walter.
Well, yeah, thank you so much, Walter. I think I just, on this topic, I just like to, I insisted this would be, a dialogue, not a debate, because I think there's so much shared premises, shared lineage, and kind of a shared priorities with these two positions. The for-profit government people, which is really a pygmy, as modern ideologies go. Anarcho-capitalism might not be, ruling the world of ideas. It might not be, the mainstay of universities, but there are a few, academic professors who would call themselves anarcho-capitalists, probably comparable in number to the ones who, might call themselves, left-wing anarchists. So yeah, and it has a think tank. It's this somewhat vital tradition. The for-profit government thing is a very different beast. It's a kind of a unique proposal, kind of, Hans Hoppe kind of prefigured it, but the person to articulate it to a broad audience was Curtis Yarvin. But basically, no one believes in this. I think the people who who really have accepted this argument, you could probably count them on a few hands. Um, I think that's kind of too bad in a certain way. So there's no for-profit government think tank. It's a new thing. It doesn't have this like real subculture the way that the radical libertarian people do. But that being said, I think like I see in the for-profit government thing as a more a difference in emphasis, and not truly an ideological difference from the anarcho-capitalism people, comes out of the absolutely the same tradition, and I think there's almost I think we could find a lot of common ground, maybe only that there's some difference in emphasis that I think comes down to like that we don't have empirics on what is how these governments would operate in practice. Would it make sense for them to run the roads? Walter says no. Maybe the for-profit government person says maybe. But it's an empirical question. It's kind of a Coasian question even. How much should the firm that provides defense also do, to provide other kinds of public goods?
All right. Walter, what is your opening statement?
Well, first, let me apologize for interrupting you, but
Uh,
I'm sure
by all
it
means.
was it was a friendly interruption. Um, Murray Rothbard is my mentor, my friend, my guide on issues like this. He called himself an anarcho-capitalist. If he had called himself something else, I guess I would have come along with that. For-profit government. Uh, to me, government is per se a violation of rights because they tax you and they don't allow competition. Governance is different because, the conductor of the orchestra is governing them, but it's with agreement. So I think that the key contribution of Murray Rothbard and other anarcho-capitalists is that we should adhere to the libertarian axiom, the libertarian principle of non-aggression and private property based on homesteading. And as long as we do that, then I don't know, then we should have whatever follows from that. And if private government follows from that, I guess I would have a verbal dispute with that. I don't just like calling it government because to me, government is a violation of the non-aggression principle. But apart from the verbal dispute, uh, why do we favor anarcho-capitalism? Well, because it adheres to the libertarian non-aggression principle. By the way, we're not really against government. And here's another screw up with language because we anarcho-capitalists favor 8 billion governments, namely one for each of us. We should each be supreme. We should each be in charge of ourselves, and nobody should boss anyone else around unless it's with agreement. I have to tell you my sadomasochistic joke because the sadist bosses the masochist around. And the joke is that the masochist says, "Beat me." And the sadist says, "No." I don't know if that's funny, but it tickles me. So we believe that each individual should be a sovereign, and no one should compel anyone else unless there's agreement. And nobody should hit anyone else unless there's agreement. Now, look, in boxing, the two guys get into the ring and they agree to hit above the belt and not to butt each other or bite each other, and they just hit above the belt. And now somebody hits me, and I sue him for assault and battery. No, I've agreed to be hit above the belt, and I was just punched in the jaw, so that's okay. So I think that if for-profit government or for-profit governance adheres to the non-aggression principle, and I think the way Stephen would articulate it, it would, then I'm for that as well.
All right. Well, now let's take 5 minutes for Werner to ask questions to Walter. And I guess I have a Steve, Werner, you could take this or leave it, but do you think that that do you envision for-profit governments strictly adhering to the non-aggression principle or no?
Yeah, so I think, and I think that like that is like the actual like ideological difference here, um that for so how did I find for-profit government? The person who articulated it was Curtis Yarvin. I worked for Curtis Yarvin for a year trying to set up a think tank. It kind of didn't end up working out, but it was still a lot of fun. And so Yarvin's my mentor. If Yarvin still called himself an anarcho-capitalist, perhaps as he was when he was 30 years old, perhaps I would call myself an anarcho-capitalist. But I think the innovation. Yarvin had a couple innovations on the like Hoppe argument of for monarchy. So he jettisoned the private law society part. But I think also he kind of dispensed with the non-aggression principle in a way that I think you guys would find very objectionable. So, Yarvin was originally an internet Austrian, like so many people in what the online right became. The online right, is a somewhat significant thing. People talk about its connections to all these politicians. Um, and so many of the leading figures in that movement, Yarvin, Richard Hanania, Bronze Age pervert, Tyler Cowen, who's a kind of different figure, but in his own way, a very important part of the online right. Of the five most important, people on the online right, maybe four of them came out of an Austrian background. But Yarvin was maybe the most studied. He read all of Mises. He could quote Mises, as long as you want. But his innovation, beyond the like the ANCAP people, I think was that we're not grounded in the non-aggression principle. Instead, we're just normal utilitarians for the most part. Um, that I think Milton Friedman and maybe Simon, you probably recognize this as a young libertarian growing up. You see recommended on YouTube, Free to Choose. And I think there's a cool clip where some British fellow is challenging Mr. Friedman on you know Mr. Friedman, Dr. Friedman is, if liberty and utility ever come into conflict, which is it? And Mises and Friedman very eloquently kind of cops out. He doesn't really answer. It sounds great, but he doesn't answer. Do I actually care about utility or do I care about these abstract principles of rights? You know, for Professor Block, I hear all this, so my main priority is the non-aggression principle. If the for-profit government, stands by, the non-aggression principle, then I could support it. You know, for and I think this is a kind of unbridgeable divide. Is like, what do we actually value? Are you deontological? Do you care about this non-aggression principle? Or do you think, okay, well, and my position is, I think the state should mostly obey the non-aggression principle because that mostly results in a free society, a prosperous and good society. But the real ends are the prosperous and good society. And in some exotic case, if they ever came into conflict, oh, should he be able to own nuclear weapons? Does that constitute aggression? I'm not interested in, oh, does it is it justified by the non-aggression principle to stop the fellow from owning nuclear weapons? I say don't even have the debate, just go after him. So I think this is a famously kind of unbridgeable divide, right? Do we the utilitarian deontological debate, it's not something you could just solve. We certainly won't solve it here. But I think this is an interesting difference.
Do you have any specific questions for Walter?
And sorry that didn't end in a question mark, but like, so I think you Professor Block do think that if even adopting the frame of utilitarian, it would be optimal to have our anarcho-capitalism. Um, but I take it you aren't a utilitarian, and do you think if utility and liberty ever came into conflict, you choose liberty? I choose utility, but
Well, I can think of cases where um, I would choose utility.
yeah,
I've written about the Martians.
yeah,
The Martians are evil and they're all powerful. And they beam down a message to the Earth: kill the next person that walks down the street, or we'll blow up the whole world. And this guy's going to die anyway. Well, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go kill him.
yeah,
Because if I don't kill him, and we stipulate that the Martians are truthful, they're evil, but they're truthful, and they'll blow up the whole world. They'll make us like the asteroid belt, which is just a bunch of little rocks, and we'll all die. Well, I'm going to go kill him. And that's a violation of liberty. I mean, murder is incompatible with the non-aggression principle, but I'm going to kill him. And now what you guys decide to do is you're libertarians, and you're going to have the death penalty for me. And one of my favorite supports of the death penalty is Robert Nozick's, or he never came up with this, but I think I came up with it. I forget, but it was inspired by him. It's a life transfer machine. And what it is you put me, alive, murderer, in the machine with this dead guy that I just killed, and you flip the switch, and now the life seeps out of me and gets back into him. Well, is this justified? Oh, darn tootin' it's justified because, I stole his life. And certainly part of libertarian punishment theory is to, return what you stole. Well, I stole his life, so I should be forced to return it. And you know what the Martians say? They say, well, if you do that, we're blowing up the world. These Martians are a one-track type of people. And so again, I'm going to say, okay, then don't kill me. Don't adhere to the libertarian principle of execution and life transfer machine. By the way, about execution, there's a big debate: is the death penalty going to reduce the murder rate? And it doesn't,
yes,
but executions do. So that's a sort of a sidelight. So my answer to Mr. Miller's question, look, if he's going to call me Professor Block, I can call him Mr. Miller. Um, my answer is, well, I'm both. I'm a utilitarian, and I'm also, I guess, a praxeologist in the sense of I deduce everything from the non-aggression principle. But, look at how weird you have to get in order to uh, uh, overcome libertarianism. You have to invent Martians. Here's another example. It's the 1930s, and a black man is in jail accused of raping a white woman, and the mob wants to hang him. And the mob says to the sheriff, let us grab this guy, we'll hang him, and one guy will die. And by the way, he's innocent. He didn't do anything wrong. And now utilitarianism says, uh, let him go. Let's execute this black guy, innocent black guy, because if we allow the violation of libertarianism, one person dies, one innocent person dies. If we don't, then the mob is going to go overrun the sheriff, kill the sheriff. The sheriff is going to kill half the mob, and the black guy is going to die anyway in the melee. So if you're a utilitarian, let's kill the guy. Now, the only answer to that, the way I see it, is, but this will set precedent. Because
Yeah, right.
if you start
Norms are
letting
important. Yeah.
if you start letting mobs
Yeah.
kill innocent people, this is not kosher. But
Yeah.
then what we could say is, well, the whole world ends right then. After the whole world ends right after this scenario.
Well, then it doesn't matter that much anyway,
Well,
utils wise, right? So,
but still, we want to
yeah.
know: should we uphold justice and libertarian theory, or should we be utilitarians? Well, if the whole world is going to end anyway, well, then what the heck? Let's uphold justice. But the point is, you have to come up with weird cases like this to diverge libertarianism from utilitarianism. If you want to, one of my books is I forget what it's called, some sort of statistical correlation between economic freedom and prosperity. And you'll never guess. The more the more economic freedom a country has,
Yes.
the higher the GDP per capita is.
I
So
post such regressions on Twitter a lot. Yes, absolutely.
I think I co-authored that with Jim Gortney and
Yes.
I forget the other guy's name.
And I think it is sort of telling that, kind of there's no leftist answer to this. There is no like leftist version of the ease of doing business index where they talk about the strength of regulation index. They would never do such a thing because it would be embarrassing.
I mean, look, rent control, minimum wage,
Yeah.
the central banks, all of that is there's no divergence between libertarian theory and utilitarianism. Now, look,
Yeah.
David Friedman, you mentioned Milton Friedman, but David Friedman is a utilitarian, but he's an anarcho-capitalist.
Yes.
Well, what the heck? He and I are brothers. We
Yeah.
agree on anarcho-capitalism. We emphasize different things. This leads me to the question, well, what's the best way to promote liberty? And my answer is there's no one best way. We should each do it our own way. And why do I say this? I ask, well, who are the most successful people in converting people to libertarianism? And my answer is Ayn Rand for my generation, Ron Paul for the next generation, and Milton Friedman and Hayek are in the mix somewhere, but they were all so different. I mean, Ron Paul is a sweetie pie. You call Ayn Rand a sweetie pie and she'll smack you. I mean, she was not a sweetie pie.
All right. Werner is up next. You have 5 minutes to ask questions to Walter.
Yeah, and sorry, I feel I should have written some down. I mean, we could talk about, the deep specifics of where the positions might be subtly different. I mean, I think what do you think about how the national defense insurance company things will work? How will they compete with each other? Isn't this a natural monopoly? Why not call it government then? At least it makes our position more legible to people. You talk about promoting liberty. I just want people to understand what I'm saying. If a for-profit government, I think that's extremely descriptive. It implies this very, very specific sort of structure. Um, how do you think like the national defense, protection insurance company things will work? How will they compete with each other? I suspect they're a natural monopoly, and what we would end up with would look a lot more like the current government than I think many would suppose.
Well, as an Austrian, I don't like the phrase natural monopoly. I don't think there's any such thing as a natural
Yeah.
monopoly.
Well, and I think this is, and to go on a bit of a tangent here, but I think this is something kind of fundamental in, the online right tradition, inheriting from Austrian econ that, so Rothbard maybe rehabilitates monopoly to some extent. And then you could argue the most famous online right book, the most read online right book is, Peter Thiel's Zero to One, which makes the case that natural monopolies are just good and we should have natural monopolies. So, I think, I certainly don't want to justify antitrust, which is, of course, nonsense on stilts. But, I think, there are some industries where it kind of makes sense to just have one firm. And I think it's quite plausible that national defense is one of those.
Well, you know, Murray wrote about the one big firm in
Yes.
what's it?
Well, we don't want one firm running the whole economy. That's obviously awful, but
Well, what he says is that if one firm were so successful that they'd be running the whole economy, it would be like central planning, and therefore
yes.
it couldn't occur. Look, there's a big difference between one firm in an industry and a monopoly. Again, we're having a verbal
Okay.
dispute.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
No, I don't want to scare you with the language, but I think if there's one firm in the national defense sector, is it so wrong to call it a government? Especially if you don't like, you're not. If the concept of rights isn't so central to your thinking, like me.
well, why call it a government? I mean, the way I see it,
Yes.
in the United States, there'd be 100 competing defense agencies.
Yeah. Well,
100,
I don't
100.
envision it that way. I guess that's the distinction. And this is, but this is, I think this shows how close the positions really are, is that this is like, how many firms should there be in an industry? That's not like a political theory question, really. That's a Coasian, like, more empirical economics question. And I think that's, kind of the beauty of, bridging the gap between, uh, for-profit government and anarcho-capitalism is you get these very, very specific disputes of, I think there will be one really big firm that will encompass the whole United States. And, and others could think that there will be lots of small firms, but, it becomes this very different sort of question that you apply, real economic analysis to instead of political theory.
Well, I think there'd be 100 firms or
Yeah.
500 or whatever the number is. However, if there were a foreign enemy, and
Yeah.
let's pick the Martians as the foreign enemy, they would coalesce. They would all cooperate to fight off the Martians or whoever
Yes.
the enemy was. So, for some purposes, there'd be 100 or 500
Yeah.
little firms, each doing police work. And for other purposes, there'd be one big firm. But why call it a government? Don't we need a word? I mean, the problem is we need a word for the enemy, and socialism doesn't really work because there is such a thing called voluntary socialism, like the kibbutz or the commune or the family.
Yes.
If you define socialism as from each to your ability to each according to your need, the average American family is a socialist enterprise. The little girl who's 6 years old doesn't eat in accordance with her productivity. She eats in
Yeah.
accordance with her need, as determined by the mother, usually. So
Yes.
we can't use socialism as a depiction of the bad guys. Maybe communism we can, but I think we need a word government, and we have to snarl at some word. And if you're going to take the word government and make them the good guys, well, then we just have a verbal dispute. I think it makes it not accurate to say it's a government. Why not just say that it's 100 defense agencies, but they're cooperating whenever there's an external enemy?
Yeah.
Walter,
So
you
I
have
think that
5 minutes to ask questions to Werner.
yeah, and to answer that, I think it's mostly a promoting liberty thing. People know what a government means. For-profit government, I think, is actually a very good term because it describes exactly what it is. You don't need to know tons of theory to get a sense of what that would mean. Now, I think also, kind of the resistance is I don't I'm kind of not really into the government being the enemy of that we snarl at all the time as people with this like a broadly similar critique of our institutions because I maybe you disagree, Walter, but I think it's clear in many cases like if you're just reflexively against government action you get into a lot of rather silly positions. And I think my favorite example of this is I used to work at this magazine called Works in Progress, and I think my favorite article of theirs was something about drunk driving in Britain. I forget exactly what it's called. I forget, the title. I could send it over and Simon could put it in the show notes. But, you know, you wrote about, I think, private highways. Surely we want private highways. In some sense, this is ideal. But in the meantime, do we want there to be fewer traffic cops? Well, I think the empirical case is actually there should be a lot more traffic cops. They should be, breathalyzing people to stop them from drunk driving. Now it would be better if this was done privately, but damn, if it's not going to be done privately, I guess it should be done publicly. And I think a lot of I think a lot of the these debased libertarians will get into these kind of silly reflexive contrarian anti-government positions even when the government is doing something that is at least mitigating the government's own follies by running the highways.
Well, one of my favorite governments is Javier Milei of
Yes.
Argentina. If he were to ask me to be the minister of highways or the minister of something, and assuming I
Yeah.
could speak Spanish, I would be happy to do that. So I'm not against government. Look, if only government, right now, government's in charge of the highways, and we have 40,000 people dying and maybe 100,000 people going to hospitals for very serious ailments due to traffic accidents. And if the choice is, should we have more welfare or more cops stopping drunken drivers? Well, I have children, I have grandchildren. I don't want them to be smacked up in a car accident. So I'm not against government in the sense that I don't know that I would do something illegal. I'm not bombing any governments or anything like that. I'm just saying that private enterprise is better. My book on roads claims that if we had competing road owners, we'd have many fewer accidents. And I would imagine you would agree with that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we have common cause. I think we're just having a lot of verbal disputes.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
just want to call it a government, and I don't want to call it a government.
yeah.
But
Yeah.
apart from that, we don't really have any, horrific disputes because I agree with you that given that government is in charge of the roads and in charge of welfare, they should have
Yes.
more money in roads and less in welfare. And so we have common cause there.
Yeah, yeah. So I think we mostly agree, but feel free to send over more questions. I guess it's your it's your time to ask the questions.
Oh, I have to ask you questions. Well, the usual question is why are you so stupid not to agree with me? But I'm being silly here. I don't mean that. Um, uh, I don't know. Uh, well, who do you think was a better philosopher, Curtis Yarvin or Murray Rothbard?
Ooh, yeah, I'm not really into philosophy. I'm a humble, social science student, I'm afraid. I think Yarvin is a very, very interesting scholar and figure. He in that I think, dare I say, well, I was going to say that, maybe Yarvin is a better author in some ways than Rothbard. I did really like, Rothbard's history books that I read, during my high school years. But what's his like long man economy and state? Is that his like I didn't find it that fun to read, dare I say. And Yarvin, he kind of never disappoints. It's always so witty, so funny. He makes you laugh. If you don't want that from a philosopher, what could you possibly want? So I think like I think like Rothbard like has some like really cool contributions and in serious econ his rehabilitation of monopolies, but I think Yarvin was doing something really novel by writing political theory on the internet, being kind of the first person to popularize an ideology on the internet, even if his ideology might not be quite as popular as Rothbard's, which has a much more vital subculture and a real think tank. But look, I think these are both really really cool figures in the history of this line of institutional critique.
Well,
All
let
right.
me just say, oh,
Go ahead.
uh, I was going to just say that I support all institutions and people who are trying to promote liberty. I support the Free State Project. Everyone should move to New Hampshire. I support the Libertarian Party. I support this 3L group. Mark Victor is starting it. Live and Let Live. I support 50 state free market institutions like the Pelican Institute in my home state of Louisiana. And now I support you. I support Curtis Yarvin, who I've never heard of before this
Okay,
before this
fair
conversation.
enough.
I support all attempts to promote liberty, and I might not agree with everything that everyone says. You know, the joke is that if you ask 10 libertarians what their view is, you'll get 11 opinions or 15 opinions.
Yeah.
So I support.
I've heard the same joke about some other fellows, some fellows like me, but
Well,
some
it's a
fellows like
common
us.
joke.
Yes.
It's a common joke. So
Yeah.
uh, I I don't support the Libertarian Party on everything they say. I don't support the Free State Project on everything they do. I don't support your group on everything. I have a verbal dispute with your group. You keep calling it government. You keep calling the good guys government. And I don't want to call the good guys government. I want to call the good guys free enterprise somethings or others. But I support all groups who are supporting liberty.
Yeah, and I'll, just as a last thing to maybe emphasize just how small these disagreements are. I mean, why do I call it government? I think it's because, anarcho, the prefix is very negatively connotated. Capitalism is, you know, perhaps slightly less negatively connotated, but still in most circles extremely negatively connotated. Whereas for-profit government is just something totally foreign, and it certainly gets people to think if they're listening. So I think it's the most pragmatic thing you could possibly imagine. Why do we call it for-profit government? I mean, I guess there is a difference in emphasis of, we're more interested on what would that firm be like. We have more ideas about how it would be designed. Yarvin believes that it should have a board of directors, it should trade shares on the stock exchange. And I don't think you would disagree about all of that, but we get more interested in the plans.
Well, I do agree with
Werner,
that. The word anarchism is not a good word. I mean, most people hear anarchism, they think chaos. They think
Yes.
riots in the street or some craziness like that. So I agree with you that anarcho-capitalism, the anarcho part is very bad. The capitalist part is not that much better in the view of many people who've been socialized, under Bernie Sanders or somebody like that.
Yeah.
But again, if we look at who are the most successful people, Ayn Rand, Ron Paul, Milton Friedman. I mean, in my view, Mises and Rothbard were much better than those three, but they didn't have as big a megaphone, whereas those three had a big megaphone. And those are our three people. I mean, now we've now changed the subject a little bit, and now we're talking about not what is liberty, but what's the best way to promote liberty. And I think the best way to promote liberty is to forget about the word anarchy, which is a big turnoff, and maybe talk about free enterprise or economic liberty or
Yes.
something like that. But again, each person should promote liberty in the way that they're most comfortable. We should have fun. And if I tell you, no, Steve, you can't promote liberty in your way, you have to do it in my way. First of all, I'm not going to say that. Second of all, if you did that, you wouldn't be as effective because you wouldn't be having as much fun and you'd have libertarian burnout. So I say, God bless, although I'm an atheist, but God bless, go promote liberty and with, what is it, profit-seeking government or profit-maximizing government, the
For-profit government, I think is the cleanest, but
for-profit government,
yeah.
go get them. And
Yeah.
I
And
hope.
the term Yarvin uses in the original blogs is neocameralism, which I think not something you'd hear very much. I'm trying to make the for-profit government a thing, the for-profit
But
government.
but now we're
Werner,
talking about but now we're talking about what's the best way to promote government, whereas
Yeah.
we were supposed to be talking about what is liberty. So I think in terms of what is liberty, we agree pretty
Yeah.
much. We're both utilitarian and deontologists, and we each promote liberty in a slightly different way. I'm more oriented toward economics. Some philosophy professor be more oriented toward philosophy, but we're all on the same team.
Um, Werner, I want to maybe sharpen some of the details on what a
Yeah.
for-profit government would be like. You said in one of your Substack posts that we don't have to worry about the for-profit government oppressing or genociding its citizens because the citizens are assets, so it will want them to be productive. But do
Yes.
you literally mean that the sovereign corporation, the for-profit government, will own the citizens as assets?
Yeah, so I think this is like another a possible point of disagreement because you know well, that sounds like it violates the non-aggression principle. But I think, I'm more interested in, instead of those abstract things, how can we give the government good incentives so that it will not, oppress the citizens? And I think the best way to give it those incentives is for a profit maximizing, state to, in the most abstract sense be if it wanted be able to take all your income, be able to do what it wants with you, because then the incentives are somewhat perfectly aligned. And I think this is kind of the Yarvinist, one of the Yarvin mantras: limited government is a contradiction in terms. The written constitution thing, it obviously failed. We have all these horrible problems that um Professor Block explicates, others explicate.
Well,
And
Walter, do you
yeah.
agree that limited government is a contradiction in terms?
Limited government is a contradiction in terms. Simon, let me say, I promised you an hour, and we're coming up to the hour. I know we started a little late because we had some screw-ups,
That's yeah, that's my fault.
but
How
I've
much
got to
more
get
time do you
off it.
have?
But I've got 3 more minutes because I
Okay.
promised you an hour, and I have an appointment. Is limited government a contradiction in terms? No, of course not. The U.S. has a more limited government than Cuba. And thank goodness. That's why people are trying to get out of Cuba and into the U.S. There are very few people trying to get out of the U.S. and into Cuba. The same with East Germany and West Germany, North and South Korea. We have all sorts of almost controlled experiments to show that government is bad, that the more government you have, the worse the citizenry are. Look, I got to get off now. It's been a pleasure. I greatly enjoyed
Yes, thank you
this.
so much for joining.
Thank you so
And
much.
take care. Thank
Take
you.
care, Walter.
Bye.
Werner, do you want to discuss this with me for a few more minutes?
Yeah, absolutely.
So on what the for-profit government would be like, would the citizens be able to leave, for example?
So I think it, as I, limited government is a contradiction in terms. You can't force the government to if you can't force the government through like a written constitution to do something it doesn't want because nothing else can stop it. It's the absolute authority. So it's up to the for-profit government what they'll choose, and I think they will choose to let people leave. Otherwise, it would be hard to get people to come.
Right. So you're saying that if that there's
It will do
there's
the
no
profit
like
maximizing
constitutional
thing. Yeah.
constraint, but they have this financial incentive
Yeah.
to give people freedom because otherwise no one wants to move there.
Yes, and I think um well yeah I think that's about right. But what I think is interesting about this kind of analysis is it takes it takes these normally political questions, should there be freedom of movement, and makes them these kinds of questions that you answer with microeconomics, where what's the best thing for the firm to do in this instance? Well, that's usually considered like a kind of like banal, like trivial question that you would encounter in micro or even business class. And instead, we're doing political theory in that very different mode, which I think is very interesting and very fruitful.
Yarvin has used the term patchwork. He talks about there being a patchwork of many different for-profit states. Doesn't that implicitly concede that divided power is better if there are many states instead of just one state?
Yeah, so I think and this my answer might be kind of different from Yarbin's, but what I say is this is fundamentally a coast question. How big should this firm be?
Hmm.
How much what of its power should it give to its little subsidiaries? And we don't really know what the profit maximizing way of running this firm would be. That's why I support experimentation, and maybe Professor Block doesn't like experimentation. He has some ideological aversion to, the term experimentation. But I think if we wanted to answer questions like this, we would have to, give it a shot, have some, our finest CEOs take up the task of
So
running
we
a
don't yet know the
government.
optimal firm size. We don't yet know the optimal geographic extent of these
Yeah.
for-profit states.
We can make some educated guesses, but my prior is that I think the optimal firm size will be larger in many ways than Yarvin envisioned with patchwork.
Okay. Do you consider North Korea to be a for-profit state?
No.
Why not?
I think well, so in some in every state there are some for-profit kind of elements. The big the big a lot of welfare you could think of as kind of disguised dividends or something.
Hmm.
Certainly with like public employee unions or something, it's like
Hmm.
it has a lot of very similar properties to dividends. And you could watch the institutions being built up around them in these very different forms. But in different situations, the same, like, fundamental economics kind of surfaces. But yeah, in what respect is North Korea, not a for-profit government? I think that's not really what is on Kim Jong-un's mind. He wants to maximize several things, but like, money is not like really at the top of the list for him. He
But
he
there are
has
many
some
rich people who think about things other than money. In fact, the more money you have, the lower marginal value of an additional dollar.
Yeah, absolutely. But and that's why, in Yarvin's preferred construction for the for-profit government, we have a board, we have shareholders, like a normal public corporation, because that's how they solve those problems. If,
Well,
in
hang on
terms
a
of
minute.
bad corporate governance.
If
Yeah.
these board members are also very wealthy, it seems like they're also going to have a low marginal value of an additional dollar.
True.
And if the shareholders are just regular people, I mean, then it's not clear how their incentives are that much different from the incentives of voters. Because in any election where there are many, many voters, your individual vote doesn't matter that much. And so, like I'm sure Brian Kaplan would argue that if there are millions of shareholders, maybe some people are going to vote for what sounds good rather than the best policy because their vote doesn't matter that much anyway.
Yeah, so Kaplan actually, shared this critique, and I think it's a very, very good one. I think like, in the list of like strongest arguments like against neocameralism, I think, the Garrett Jones case against neocameralism, I think is the best. Which is just that like if you look historically, this is not how most successful states were run. Most successful states seem to be run as a kind of oligarchy, and where the CEO, the king or whatever, isn't actually that powerful, and it's mostly, the barons and that or some other groups of like little cabals that he thinks are overperform. They overperform at the Federal Reserve. Jones emphasizes that these little groups are are the kind of optimal way of running things. So and that is, but anyway, but I think the Kaplan critique is of course extremely strong. That being said, you know in for-profit companies today, this seems to work pretty well. And why? Because you
That's
get more
true.
votes if you're bigger. Like, and this is, I think, and why I'm still so loyal to this system is that this is how every effective organization in our society runs. If there was, some stupendous way of solving this problem, and maybe Robin Hanson could come up with some, but like, damn, like, we don't use them. And if futarchies start
Hmm.
replacing, our firms, then maybe we should have a futarchy. I certainly think, maybe there should be futarchic elements in the for-profit government. Maybe the for-profit government would experiment with, futarchic things. It would consult prediction markets to know, the outcomes of various policies. But, I think it is striking that, the Kaplanian like, myth of the rational voter stuff, you don't hear much about it with companies, which I think suggests that you get so much mileage from just giving, rich people more franchise.
All right. Werner Zagrebbi, thank you for having this dialogue.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Simon. It was a lot of fun.
All right.